My ideas on European culture really come from my parents. They lived 60 years together, happily married, but they lived 60 years of cultural schizophrenia. My father was a Scot, a Protestant, a Presbyterian. That's a Calvinist religion, and he was a confirmed monarchist. My mother was Italian, from an old Catholic family of Romagna, which is a former papal state. She was a Republican and an admirer of the Enlightenment and of Garibaldi. So I tried for many years to understand this cultural schizophrenia that they had, and I came to the conclusion that this Northern European, as my father, as a Protestant monarchist, was very, very far removed in terms of values and behaviors from my mother, who was a Southern European and a Catholic Republican. So then I went on to say, well, what does it mean to be monarchical and Protestant and Republican and Catholic, and how would that change values and behaviors in people? So if I treat first of all monarchy is 1,000 years old in Europe. It binds subjects to their feudal superiors. It was very successful as feudalism because it helped to raise armies to protect the monarch and his family, and it gave, and it's always given, a lot of importance to the protection of individual power and of family property from this impersonal body that we call the state. The identity of a community of citizens that we find in a republic has really got little weight in monarchy, where we speak not of citizens but of subjects. Machiavelli tells us why. The age-old aim of feudalism is to ensure the survival and protection of the prince, in his case, of a monarch, and that of his family, protecting their land from neighboring pilfering states. And this was largely served by institutionalizing mistrust of foreigners. We call this mistrust today xenophobia, and still find a lot more of it today in monarchies than we do in republics. During the Reformation in Northern Europe, this mistrust led to the creation of national Protestant churches, whereas in the south, the royal houses of France and Spain searched for alliance with the Roman Church. So the control of religion was a key factor of monarchical survival. Machiavelli, who was later quoted by Rousseau, who was a Republican, wrote in The Prince that a monarch can far more easily govern his subjects if he places religious power at his own service. Henry VIII had read his Machiavelli and created the Church of England to protect his own monarchical prerogative from dogmatic Catholicism, whilst usefully maintaining an institutionalized church. Monarchy is a last bastion of protection of individual and family property against a greedy state, which, as a republic, if we are to believe Rousseau, more readily defends the collective interests of the community against those of the individual. Monarchy is a protection of the royal family by a series of concentric social circles which separate subjects into classes, from the most aristocratic to the most untouchable, a society which leads each one to adapt his or her words to the social class of the other. So the master speaks differently to the servant than the way in which the servant replies to the master. So this strange relation of personal feudal service between master and servant, frankly, has no place for the team idea so dear to Republicans. It's far too personal. This relationship exalts the duties of the servant to his master, who in return provides security and privilege. Monarchy isolates people into their classes and unites them under their master, but not as a community. We see this in all walks of monarchical society, from the royal families and their aristocracy to relationships in the office with the boss. Monarchical societies have strict codes of communication, both within classes and between them. These codes isolate and facilitate, but they don't unite. An aristocrat will feel more at home with a garbage collector speaking with an Oxford accent than a rich man speaking in estuary English. Class isolation encourages formality and secrecy, which a servant owes as a duty to his master, and hides a form of class violence, of inclusion and exclusion, which on the face of it looks surprisingly harmless. So, how does that affect the behavior and values of people who derive their values from monarchism? The first point, I think, is the acceptability of individual privilege, which, after all, has been accorded by the monarch, who is the fount of all honour, and which recognises that indeed men are not born equal at all. The protection at all costs of individual and family property and rights from the pilfering collective, starting, of course, with those rights of the first family of the land. The glorification of duty before that of rights. And our 19th century Victorian ancestors did much to fantasize how important it was for each man to do his duty, meaning to a monarch who, of course, impersonates the nation. And the virtual non-existent republican idea of the community of citizens, which is replaced in monarchy by the idea of nationhood, which is centered upon the person of the monarch, and a comfortable nationalized religion designed to control comfortably his subjects or her subjects. And finally, this compulsive distrust of other nations, each one invariably classed as a threat or not to the monarch's privilege and property. Secondly, what I call reformism. My father's family was Presbyterian. This form of Calvinist Protestantism was inspired by French Cathar theology dating to before the Reformation. It's a tough religion which is suited to rainy Scotland and which, unlike Catholicism, gives the rich a chance. Also, unlike Catholicism, it gives rather more weight to pragmatism than to post-biblical revelation, or what the Catholic Church calls tradition. But it leaves the believer far more lonely and accountable before God than does the far more optimistic theology of Rome. Classical Calvinism defends the tough doctrine of predestination, which does not mean that a man can earn salvation through his own works, but that he is subject to an unchangeable personal destiny. God knows from all eternity whether each man has been elected to paradise or condemned to burn in hell. Calvin deduces that despite the fact that God is all-knowing and all-powerful, if he willingly does not intervene to save the condemned man from hell during his lifetime, then such a man must be predestined to damnation, and that God must know this from all eternity. Calvin holds that because man's intelligence is God-given, any mystical construction to deny this idea of predestination is just not admissible. Calvin's thought is pragmatic and this worldly. He rejects the more optimistic Catholic doctrine of free will, which accepts that a man can somehow engineer his salvation in real time through good works and a return to virtue. According to Max Weber, an early 20th century German sociologist who identified the origin of capitalism with Calvinism, the Calvinist believer welcomes the money of this world as a gift from God given by God to the virtuous, hard-working man. Money granted to a man is a sign that God has elected him to a destiny in paradise. And since the virtuous man does not spend money for his own pleasure, his asceticism brings him to save his money up in the form of capital, unless he spends it to promote God's work. This certainly contradicts the Catholic Franciscan distrust of money, I shall discuss later. Whilst recognizing that there are degrees of Protestantism covering the spectrum from Anglo-Catholicism to Calvinism, I still call the person who's brought up in Protestant society a reformist. Whether he is of Protestant or Catholic doctrine, he will still be a reformist because he's influenced by the values and behavior of an essentially Protestant majority culture. So what do we mean by reformist values? They're characterized by this pessimistic sense of loneliness before one's destiny, described by Max Weber, which leads a man to examine his own behavior and that of others for signs of virtue to understand whether he is destined for heaven or for hell. This gives the reformist a relatively rigid view of what virtue is, and we call this moral absolutism. Also, his suspicion of the poor, who because they are poor are probably not virtuous and not part of God's elect, and who are destined, yes, but possibly not for heaven. His greater comfort too with the human thought of this world, which is analytical, linear, empirical, and which essentially rejects mystic conjecture about the other world. In this way, the reformist is a pragmatist and distrusts dogmatism. His preference for what we call inductive thought, which follows a logic cycle of facts, outcomes, and conclusions. This is faster, if less precise, as a way of reaching a conclusion than the more laborious deductive method of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, which we call Cartesian, and which, for the reformists, probably wastes too much time. And this preoccupation with time, which is a gift of God to man, and which is too precious to waste. We're going to quantify time. We're going to save it. So we quantify time in reformist society. His admiration of modesty and asceticism, including a prevailing dislike of showing emotion, which the virtuous are not expected to show. So now I've described some of the key drivers of monarchical and reformist values that were my father's. Let's look at the Republican and Romanist values that were my mother's. I'll start with republicanism. Despite Mussolini's support of the House of Savoy, so a monarchist support, the ideas of my mother were nevertheless inspired by a frankly Republican ethic. She grew up in the wake of the Risorgimento, this popular movement that was a fruit of the Enlightenment and of the romantic image of a unified Italy under Garibaldi, Mazzini, and Cavour. She was influenced by the concept of the Commune, as we saw in Paris in 1870, and by this sacred ideal of a state which was promoted by the French revolutionaries of 1789 to counter the idea of an anointed monarch. So when, with the help of France, the Risorgimento ended in unifying Italy, France was in the grips of the Franco-Prussian War and of the egalitarian and fraternal Paris Commune. The leading Italian statesman Mazzini had distinctly Republican tastes and set about building a new constitutionally Republican model for his country. As France had shown, this libertarian republic, so equality, liberty, fraternity, as being the three maxims of the saintly state, had frankly no room for a competing god. And anti-clericalism rooted itself from 1849, when the Italian statesman Cavour, following the example of Napoleon, decided to grab the old papal states. The Italians didn't execute their priests as the French had guillotined their own, because the opposition of the new republic to the Vatican was less violent than Voltaire's or Robespierre's. After all, the humanistic and egalitarian values of the Republic were not so far removed from those of St. Francis in support of the poor and the weak. And then, if Assisi was only a few valleys away, so was the Vatican itself. So France led the way in Europe to what we call the Constitutional Republic. Those who have grown up under its wing have been deeply influenced by the ideals of Voltaire and of Rousseau. And their values generally express this quasi-divinization of the state. And a form of humanism, tells us Voltaire, which hardly admits of competition from the church for men's minds. The redistribution of wealth throughout the state to achieve egalitarianism, and carried out by a state with no human face, because there is no monarch. The sanctity of citizen service to the interests of the state on behalf of the community, which takes precedence over the interests of any individual citizen. This communitarianism, demonstrated in the street by the citizen and by his family, which is the only place where a republic acknowledges their existence as individuals with a minority interest, because it is the collective that comes first. The sacrosanct principle of meritocracy, which is the antithesis of aristocracy, in the choice of those who govern, with the widespread rejection of birthright or of individual power of privilege, which has not been assigned to citizens by democratic election. This aggressive defense of human rights, but not necessarily of human duties, were, frankly, an impersonal state is expected to assume responsibility rather than an individual. And the destruction of class differences by breaking down class barriers between citizens, all of whom are deemed to be free and equal at birth, but which monarchists consider to be untrue. And finally, Romanism, my mother's Catholicism. that of an Italian child shortly before the war, in 1939-45, and with a profile that I call Romanist. She spent her youth under the papacy of Pius XI, very characteristic of traditional dogmatism and of a powerful, nurturing mother church. Although Roman Catholicism gives immense weight to the other world, Mother Church nonetheless imposed her temporal power on the feudal and absolute monarchies of this world throughout Europe for 1,000 years up to the Reformation. We're talking about a Roman Catholicism that is 2,000 years old. Her Roman Catholicism was not yet touched by the liberalism of the Second Vatican Council. And a church that was still able to impose dogma as unquestionable truth, despite the difficulties for the faithful in a scientific age to grasp revelation, which appears to be in conflict with scientific experience of this world. So this Catholicism, offering its faithful the catharsis of the great sacrament of divine absolution, which in the very Roman Catholic understanding of a never-forgiving God, is spoken by a man whose soul has received the seal of priestly ordination. It's a very Franciscan Catholicism, praising these almost effeminate virtues of weakness and poverty. Nonetheless, a Roman Catholicism that is rock hard, with a violent tradition of excommunication of heretics from the community of the faithful, and if the papal see says so, also probably from paradise itself. From the Inquisition to the wars of religion, the Church's struggles for theological territory shows something of the imperialism of a monarchy, which technically the Vatican is. So what's the impact of Roman Catholicism on the values and on the behavior of those I call Romanists? Again, whether a person is Catholic or a Protestant, if he or she is brought up in a nation with a predominantly Roman Catholic majority, he or she is led to adapt his or her values to that society and is essentially a Romanist. For example, the members of the French Reformed Church in France, which was a Calvinist church, do not realistically fall into the reformist category. As British Catholics, recusant or not, can't realistically be termed Romanists, as one might term, for example, a Spaniard. So what are the characteristics which distinguish Romanists? First of all, this ability on the basis of faith alone to accommodate otherworldly doctrine, which appears to be in scientific conflict in this world with daily life. Now, this requires a thought mechanism that I call elliptical thought. Elliptical thought helps to grasp doctrine by rejecting black and white conclusions about morality. Let me explain this a little more. The Romanist is not as enthusiastic about black and white absolutist morality as the Calvinist is. If Roman Catholic dogma must be taken on faith, then the world is complex and nothing is so simple. All moral reasoning is in shades of grey and not in black and white. Divine logic is not human logic, so the idea of absolute virtue or absolute vice is a blur. In any case, the good Lord forgives man's weakness and lack of understanding through his sacrament, so why worry? This is what I call elliptical reasoning. It never quite gets to the absolutist deadlock that paralyzes Calvinists about the so-called right thing to do. It's this reasoning that allows the vast majority of Catholics to practice contraception anyway, with little fear of moral consequences, despite the fact that the Vatican has proclaimed itself against contraception. Or to the Church's optimistic forgiveness of the vilest criminals through its sacrament. It's thought without constraints that perfectly embraces mysticism and as a consequence even frees up the artistic mind. Very creative. The deductive thought process of Cartesianism, which the fathers of the Catholic Church are very famous for, brings rigor, the rigor of a dose of human logic to those complex shades of grey I've just spoken about, providing that unprovable dogma, such as the very existence of God, is accepted first. This is Descartes' point. Then the philosophical doctors of the Church have used logical tools to deduce all the rest. St. Augustine was a master of this. So the Cartesian tradition gives a classical Romanist a great taste for discussion and debate, providing it does not question dogma. Another point is outsourcing the responsibility for the state of his soul to a very powerful Mother Church. This leads to a lot of optimism about the afterlife, but possibly to a certain complacency too. Why worry about sin when divine forgiveness is available at the hands of a clerical aristocracy? This is indeed very far from the lonely journey of the Calvinist to election or to inevitable damnation. We have this strange Franciscan admiration of weakness and of poverty, where everywhere else it's considered to be disastrous and unacceptable. And the consequent guilt of having money, when salvation would appear to be gained through human misery. And this, of course, is the doctrine of original sin. And the denial among Romanists of the importance of time in this world. Why worry about time when compared with God's promise of eternity? So how do these historical, religious, and political movements affect behavior today? I consider they were relevant for my parents' behavior and values. But are they really that relevant today? Religion. Now, as I thought about these differences, two ideas struck me about my parents. The first was that their values were essentially shaped by these religious and political beliefs. That is, by their Catholicism or Protestantism and by their inclination towards monarchy or republic. That they showed two contrasting extremes of European cultures. One a reformist monarchist from the north and the other a Romanist republican from the south. The first of these ideas is that religious and political differences really do determine culture. I tried to find other influences at this same high level to define European behavior and values, but none had the same historical and sweeping hold on the Europeans as religion and political beliefs do. I found no other cultural factors that have killed so many innocent people down through the ages as religion and political beliefs have. Many people believe today that religion does not matter, yet many of these same people appear to find some kind of significant difference between Christians and Muslims. Why would that be if religion was not a component of culture? Many agnostic journalists write that they perceive a threat from Islam. Are they concerned about doctrinal, theological differences? Of course not. They're concerned about cultural ones. Those same journalists should take out their history books. Some centuries ago, it was the turn of the crusading Christians to attack Islam. Islam is currently living its 13th century. In Christianity's 13th century, the Crusades were still a hot topic. Islam is a militant expansionist religion which is still getting over its 500 years of Ottoman domination. The latent antagonism between Christianity and Islam is 1,000 years old. It's about culture rather than about doctrine. It's unresolved, and it kills people. So I repeat my question, does religion matter in understanding culture? Of course it does. You could argue that Christianity is not Islam and that the difference between Protestants and Catholics are now really too minor to make a difference. I invite anyone who believes that to ask the question in Belfast. How would such a person explain away the 3,500 violent murders in this city over the past 30 years? How is a religious prejudice of Protestants and Catholics in Belfast any different from that of Mary Tudor, who burnt 300 Protestants alive, or that of Catherine de Medicis, her St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of tens of thousands of Huguenots, or for that matter, of the other Tudors who burnt or drew and quartered and beheaded Catholic recusant martyrs? And doctrinal differences between Catholicism and Protestantism are far weaker than between Christianity and Islam. If men are still ready to kill for religious conflicts, who's going to convince me that religion is not rooted in the very heart of our cultures? So yes, my mother's Romanism and my father's Reformism truly were in conflict. But if religion is a weapon of mass destruction, surely that cannot be the case of something as dull as constitutional politics. How can anyone get excited about the differences between a monarchy, constitutional or not, and a humanist republic? Both appear pretty civilized. And yet more than 15,000 French nobles and priests lost innocence, lost their heads on the guillotine during the terror period of the French Revolution in the name of political belief. This was at a time of constitutional change and a result of fiery words, some spoken by Jean-Jacques Rousseau on the idea of a social contract to remove absolute monarchy and to distribute wealth equally, and others by Voltaire, who didn't have much time for priests as the lackeys of established monarchical power. Although they detested each other, between them they whipped up popular interest in revolution. Admittedly, after the 30th coldest summers in Europe of the past 600 years. The target was the king, and the solution was the Swiss Rousseau's idea of a republic. Now here we have a case of weather driving economic poverty in an agricultural society and driving in turn a revolution. Fair enough. But although cold summers have an undeniable impact on fortunes, the weather as a cultural driver still hasn't killed as many innocents as religion and political differences have. So if Northern Europe is cold and Southern Europe warm, we can add that Northern Europe is essentially Protestant or Reformist, and Southern Europe essentially Catholic or Romanist. So my parents' cultural schizophrenia was explained not only by religious values about money, but also by attitude differences to social equality, fraternity, and to individual privilege. So if religious values and political conditioning made my parents' ideas so different, they then influenced mine as well as my sisters, and by extension, that of all Europeans, to which I add the communities founded by Europeans in the Americas, Africa, and Australasia. I'm not qualified to talk about other cultures, but I can quote the words of a Pakistani Sunni Muslim whom I met in Italy and who said to me, "You know, Bob, the Taliban are really nothing other than the Protestants of Islam." Now, the second idea is that my parents illustrated two opposing poles of European values. So let me start by giving my definition of Europe. Europe is surprisingly coherent. Despite the fact it's a multilingual group of nations, it's still the product, the common product, of 2,000 years of Christianity, 1,000 years of feudal and absolute monarchy, 500 years of Reformation thought, 250 years of Enlightenment republicanism following the French Revolution. Those are the four components: Christianity, monarchy, Protestantism as a result of the Reformation, and republicanism as a result of revolution. And of course of many, many wars of religion and of geographical territory. So when I look for a national identity of Europe, I look no further than Christianity, monarchy, and republic. This is where European ideals spring from, and other continents have developed their own different models. But Christianity, monarchy, and republic, as I define them here, are essentially European. Some European countries modernize culturally by stepping from Catholicism to Protestantism, others by quitting monarchy for republic. A few nations in the north did both, and many in the south did neither. Europe is a coherent collection of states. About 80% of Europeans are Christians, living in states almost all of which at one time or another were monarchies or feudal principalities. Today, 11 constitutional monarchies or principalities remain in Europe. The rest are republics. 20 of these republics appeared in 1917 when the German principalities, during the First World War, switched to a federation of small republics. My grandfather remembered that happening. So it's technically within living memory, almost. So the average European has an 80% probability of being Christian, holding beliefs somewhere along the Calvinist Catholic spectrum, and 100% probability of being either monarchist or Republican. This leaves us with 4 possible combinations, which I describe using the words ref for reformist, rom for Romanist, mon for monarchist, and rep for Republican. Each religious political combination gives a set of values. These are romrep, romon, refmon, and refrep. where we combine the religious and the political dimension of each individual. And we can generalize to say that every Christian European national is one of the four. I've written about these value sets in detail in Machiavelli and the Mayflower and shown how national behavioral stereotypes derive from them. It would take more time than we have here to explain, so if some of the types of behavior I describe seem strange, then I do recommend reading the book to find out more about them. Let's take each one in turn. Firstly, Romrep. This was my mother's profile and that of 45% of the Europeans who lived to the west of the former Iron Curtain. As Romanists, their thought is elliptical, and they admire poverty. As Republicans, they are communitarian and admire the state. Romreps find their political center of gravity on the left. Among others, they are the French, the Italians, the Poles, the Portuguese, and the Southern Irish. Now, how do Romrep values affect their behavior? Well, they're concerned about the weakest in society and have a tendency to distrust the rich, because Romreps are uncomfortable about money. They may say yes when they think maybe, or even when they think no. Because the world is a complex place where nothing is black or white, and where maybe or maybe not only denote shades of grey. Even if they consider themselves responsible, they rarely believe they are guilty, because ultimate responsibility lies not with them, but with Mother Church or with the overarching state. It's the dismissal of a defendant in a court of law, because forgiveness is divine, and because the defendant is poor or in misery, or was born in a housing project, and even because the victim of his crime was rich anyway. It's the mafia boss who, after a life of crime, gets a magnificent funeral from a Sicilian or a Calabrian bishop. It's the advantages and the status of working for the public sector, and it's flexibility and not obsession with principle. So secondly, we have Romon. 14% of Europeans are Romans, that is, Romanist and monarchical. Their thought processes are elliptical, and as monarchists, they have no problem with and even admire individualism and privilege. They're both conservative and mystics. We find them in Spain and among certain Belgians and Dutch. So some examples of their behavior: it's the Spanish chief executive who suddenly resigns because his American boss prefers to work with the team in Madrid rather than face-to-face, as monarchism would dictate, with his direct subordinate. And it's this chief executive's team who conclude that because the American boss does not want to work face-to-face with their leader, he's surely going to be fired. It's monarchical pride in long aristocratic names and in family mythology. We find picturesque Roman nostalgia among Romreps under various forms, such as the code of politeness of the French among themselves, or at courtly Viennese parties despite the disappearance of the Habsburgs since 1917, at the prestigious Polytechnique ball in Paris held at the Opera Garnier, where they still dance the quadrille, or at the pro bono events of various associations of the theoretically defunct French nobility. However, these caricatures of a bygone era have absolutely nothing of the hard edge of monarchy. with its class system and its cult of exclusion. Thirdly, we have Refmon. Refmon was my father's profile, and that of 12% of the Europeans. As reformists, they have no axe to grind with money, nor with the rich, nor with individual privilege. In their countries, as monarchists, people's hearts tend clearly to the right. Their countries have never seen an indigenous communist party as big as the post-war ones in France and in Italy. Refmons include especially the English, and also the Danes, the Swedes, the Norwegians, and some of the Dutch, all of which are monarchies, and all of which are reformist. I do add that for the Dutch, the population, rather like the Germans, is about half and half Catholic and Protestant. And in the case of these two countries, they are truly, from a Christian religious standpoint, in this model, pluralistic. Also because if the Dutch are monarchists, they also have a very liberal monarchy. And if the Germans are a federal republic, well, they still remember the principalities. So the geographical heart of Europe, we have these two very balanced cultural communities. Now, some Refmon characteristics are the English or the Scandinavians who don't shake hands or kiss on both cheeks every day in the fraternal and egalitarian way of the French, or who enter a meeting room without even saying hello to everyone. They are perceived by the Romreps as being cold and more cordial than friendly. Refmons hide their emotions, confusing Southern Europeans by this disconnect between what comes from their lips and what their faces show. The passion is missing so much that Southern Europeans wonder whether, for example, the English actually mean what they say. In return, it's those from the north completely shocked by the strength of unexpected Gallic oaths and by a string of nasal sounds designed to add force to a Frenchman's words. Or the breathtaking splendor of the Nobel Prize ceremony in the presence of the Swedish monarch, or the receptions thrown by the British monarch at Buckingham Palace in honor, for example, of foreign dignitaries. Both are occasions where the aristocracy gets to show its superiority to the lower classes. Or England, which is, according to the Times, split by social class from cradle to the grave, and where the subtle arts of social exclusion and inclusion are practiced by each class against its inferiors, remembering that the higher a class, the smaller the number of persons in it, and the more effectively information about the acceptability of others travels. It's the Victorian rigidity of principle to the point of accepting death on a battlefield by doing one's duty at all costs for a monarch one has never actually met. Or where schoolboys are taught to own up spontaneously about their wrongdoing. Such behavior is viewed as amazingly naive in most of the Catholic and Republican South. The outcome is a belief of monarchists in their own superiority over others, excessive pride, and a private xenophobia, subjecting all foreigners to suspicion. It's a Russian contract which fell through because a patrician, aloof Englishman was sent to negotiate it rather than a congenial, bewhiskered French or German up from the country, who would never dare to attempt a deal unless it was done over dinner. Finally, RefRep. They are 9% of the Europeans who believe in the reformist harmlessness of money and in pragmatic republican communitarianism and humanism. This is the case of Finland and of parts of Switzerland, but possibly more importantly, as a worldview, it is especially the case of the United States, which are founded on European values of Calvinism and republicanism. The Protestant preoccupation with time, which is money and can be lost or saved, brings the Americans to not to feel it necessary to take the time to understand or to explain for action to be taken, and to stop meetings only because time is up. They leave their RomRep colleagues reeling, who believe that meetings are about understanding context or getting support, and not about taking decisions. Is this why Henry Ford famously said that history is bunk? And why mistakes are repeated so often? Winston Churchill said, "You can always count on Americans to do the right thing." Calvinist, after they tried everything else. Well, that's probably Calvinist too, in that time is money and time must be saved. It's a Calvinist obsession with the right thing to do of the American TV soaps, where morality is thought to be absolute, and where morality ends up being far more destructive than constructive, if we are to believe the example that the American TV soap writers give us. The rigidity of absolute morality also disturbs RomReps. Try gently pushing a parked car using your own car bumper fender in the States, as you might in Paris, to force some parking space, but in a Zurich street, and you could find yourself violently arrested on the spot by a passing Swiss pedestrian, and find yourself in the closest police station. Similarly, waspish dislike of the sinner supports the continuation of the death penalty in the USA. Absolute morality. We saw an example of a Spanish manager resigning because an American RefRep boss who learnt open community living as a child at school and in his family was not sensitive to the cultural need in monarchy for respecting hierarchy and for the subordinate to engage one-on-one with the master. Another example of insensitivity was at this corporate dinner in Florida, where an American manager, born in the South, invited 500 international guests, including Jews, Muslims, Hindus, Shintoists, to rise before dinner while he recited a Christian grace over the microphone. Insensitivity. Certain of the cultures we have seen are clearly opposed, such as the French RomReps and the British RefMons. Others share certain values, such as the American RefReps and the British RefMons, who have common reformist values on the subject, for example, of capitalism. The rest show similar values and behavior, and among RomReps, for example, French, Italians, Portuguese, and Irish do see eye to eye about so many issues. We could include Greece or even Russia, if we accept that little separates the values of Orthodox Christianity from those of Roman Catholicism. All of these countries have reacted similarly to the prime rate financial crisis precipitated by unregulated American capitalism. Such reasoning gives a behavioral model which we can plot on a grid of 4 axes, the axes being Rom-Rep, Romon, Refmon, and Refrep. These profiles predict very well national values, behaviors, cultural differences, cultural similarities, and there's serious gaps of understanding between nationals of European countries. It helps us to understand why Europeans don't understand each other in their beliefs about time, money, communitarianism or individualism, privilege, individual or social responsibility, the role of the state, inductive or deductive thought, about pragmatism or dogmatism, about rights and duties, about class struggle or egalitarianism, about chauvinism, xenophobia, and probably a host of other isms as well. The model has been statistically confirmed using data from prominent social scientists. It may appear to suffer from the old problem of generalizing human values and behavior, but the analyses are extremely convincing as to the true existence of these stereotypes and the way in which Christian and political beliefs are indisputably at the root of the model make it very solid indeed. If you want to know more, then I do suggest you read the book. If I had to draw 2 significant conclusions from these ideas. First, the European cultural patchwork of Nordic, Baltic, Saxon, Celtic, Gallic, Hispanic, Latin, German, Greek, Slav peoples is a real challenge for those managing the European community. And I continue to be very pessimistic about the likelihood during the current generation of the dream coming true of this humanistic Rom-Rep federalism of a kind so dear to the French, Italians, and Poles, being imposed on all 27 countries of the Commonwealth, many of which are heavily Protestant and monarchical, and too far removed from any possibility of such thinking. Secondly, if the United States is to succeed in promoting its model of civilization, then it must control its isolationist impulses. A united humanist Europe must try to help the United States to control its tendency towards this reformist intolerance and to respect diversity in the global community. A conflict between China and the United States would be far more serious than the other ancient, already serious global conflict between Islam and Christianity. Understanding and accepting cultural diversity must be an educational priority everywhere, including the United States. Finally, let's not forget that the specificity of Europe is a common religion, Christianity, and 2 political constitutional models which are monarchy and republic, and which find their roots in Europe. Athens and Jerusalem may have had their role to play in European antiquity. Excuse me. But today, all European states owe their modernism to the upheavals of the Reformation and of the French Revolution, which spawned contemporary republicanism, and that far more than to Plato or to the Torah. The roles of the older monarchy and Catholicism, tempered by the younger republic and Protestantism, are the true keys today to understanding cultural differences in Europe and its satellite nations. Thank you.